Oh boy, today is the day, you guys. We are going to talk all about getting started composting at home in today's episode. But I've been talking about this episode over the last couple weeks and have been asking for your questions all about composting, and I have received quite a few, so thank you for submitting questions ahead of today's episode. But today we are just going to talk all things composting. We're going to get down and dirty with the basics. I think composting and growing food just go so perfectly together. It's just such a great complement to growing food at home and your growing practice. So I am super glad that you have decided to give this episode a listen, and let's get started. Welcome to the Growing Space podcast. I'm your host, Farmer Erin, owner of the Patio Farmer, and I believe that no matter what size space you have, you can grow food at home. Tune in each week as I share my best tips, tricks, and encouragement for tending to homegrown edible plants. I'm here to support your food growing journey. My goal for today's episode is that you will feel less intimidated by composting. Maybe you'll feel inspired to start your own compost system at home and not feel like it's going to be as gross or as weird as you might think it is. Now, that, of course, is for everyone who is not currently composting. And maybe if you are currently composting at home, you will get some new insight and some new information. So we'll spend the first little portion talking about what is composting, why it's important to compost, how to get set up, everything from like picking the spot in your yard to deciding on what method or what style is going to work for you. Surprise, there's like tons of different ways that you can set up a compost pile or a compost system. And we'll also talk about the different things that you should be adding to your compost. And then we are going to get to the questions that were submitted ahead of time. So composting is the process of breaking down, right? It's decomposition. Typically, for the home composter, this is going to be plant material. You can also compost like in industrial or commercial facilities. You can actually break down meat and dairy and bones and like all of that crazy stuff, which is not something that I would recommend for the home composter unless, which this kind of jumps ahead a little bit, but unless you are composting using a very particular method called Bokashi, and we'll talk about that here in a sec. But, composting is the breakdown of plant material. We're just going to decide on that for today's episode in the context of home composting. Compost is the breakdown of primarily plant material in some kind of controlled space or controlled environment, mainly so that you can capture all of the goodness that comes from a well-cured compost system to then apply on the soil where your plants are growing. So as things break down, they actually create nitrogen. And nitrogen is one of the main macronutrients that our plants need to grow and thrive. So as we're breaking down plant material that is no longer serving us, we are actually creating food for future plants that will obviously very much serve us very well. So those are the two main reasons why I would really encourage you to consider composting, is just because it's a great way of reducing your waste and transforming that waste into something that can be productive for your plants later. We're basically creating plant food. It's so cool. Also, it's just really neat to like watch everything break down and that whole decomp process. I don't know. Maybe I'm just too much of a plant nerd or a crazy plant lady, but I really love watching how quickly things break down and turn into rich, dark, nitrogen-filled goodness for my plants. But I feel like a lot of you who are tuning in today might be curious about the different ways that you can set up a composting system at home. I've mentioned this in previous episodes, but one of my favorite guideposts, if you will, or words of encouragement, guidance, is that you have to find what's going to work for you and what's going to work for your space within your growing practice. And I would say that that is still pretty darn true for composting. So when you're ready to start a composting system, it's important to figure out which system is going to work best for you and which system is going to work best for your space. As you might imagine, a lot of my clients, they don't have a lot of space, or if they do, they've got neighbors that are close by. They have competing priorities for how they want to use their space, whether it's like pets or children or I don't know, other things that you might have taking up a footprint in your space. There's a couple of different options to accommodate both small and large spaces. And perhaps I'll start with the large spaces and then we can get down to the smaller, more I'm going to say micro composting systems, shall we? So if you have a decent sized backyard and you have a nice little natural area, you could entertain the idea of just a traditional compost pile. So I'll just go ahead and mention the 3 composting systems that I have at home. I have a compost pile in a corner of our yard. I also have a compost tumbler and a vermicomposting system. Vermicomposting is using earthworms to help break down food. We'll talk about that here in a sec. But those are my three different systems. And the passive pile that we have, I literally use this for mainly when I'm turning over my beds and turning over my space from season to season. This is where I take kind of large bulk trash cans worth of plant material and just dump it into this pile. Now, this is, like I said, it's passive. So I am just adding things. It stays pretty aerated and it's in the shade. The process of breaking the things down in the pile is relatively pretty slow. But for me, this is just a way that I can repurpose the things that are coming out of my growing space and either just return them to the earth or capture that goodness to then apply in my raised beds for a future season. So basically what this pile looks like is I've got some wire or metal fencing to help contain it and to keep the dogs out, because I also have 3 dogs and you don't want your dogs or your pets getting in your compost or your kids. So make sure you have a way that you can block off your compost from others. It's very shady, and that's where I dump a lot of plant material just seasonally. And it works great. And if you're setting up a pile kind of similar to that, you can use as much space as you have, so if you have 20 to 30 square feet, be a great spot for a traditional pile. If you have 10 square feet, it could also be a great spot for a traditional pile. Now, when you set those up, you want to make sure that you put some kind of weed barrier. I would recommend just a ton of cardboard directly on the ground wherever you're going to start composting. Just start off with a solid 7-8 layers of cardboard before you start adding your compost on top of that pile. That's something that will help keep the weeds out of your compost pile. You really don't want, if you can help it, you don't want weeds or other invasive plants growing up and into your compost, because you'll be spreading that, ideally, later in a space where you don't want weeds or invasive plants. That's one option. It's just a traditional compost pile. Those can be in the sun or the shade, doesn't matter. You could also do a lasagna compost. I would say that's a style of a traditional compost pile or passive pile. It's where you layer out in pretty long or broad layers your browns and your greens, which we'll talk about. But you layer it out and you stack the layers on top of each other. It typically doesn't require a whole lot of turning. And then some people also do a modification of a compost pile where they have a 3-bin system. Maybe you've seen this. But they usually build the different bins out of pallets. You'll take 3 pallets and you'll kind of attach them together, and then you attach 2 more on one side. So you create like these different cells, and then you do a third one on the other side. So you have like this 1 unit of 3 different cells, if you can imagine it. And then you move your compost from one cell to the next. So it's a little bit more involved, I would say, if you're gonna practice composting in that way, just because the way that you structure that system and the reasoning for having the 3 rotating bins is because you're moving the compost from one bin. I'm saying bin, but it's more of a cell, like an open bottom cell. But you're moving that compost as a way of turning it and aerating it. If you like having that structured routine to something that you're taking care of, then this also might be a good system for you. But basically, you start off at the end and you add all of your like raw ingredients to the first cell. 1 month in, you'll turn or you'll move that material that's in the first cell to the second cell. And then, after another month goes by, you're still adding fresh material to the first cell. And now you're just letting that second cell rest. And then in the 3rd month, you come and you take the material from the second cell and you move it to the 3rd cell. And then you move the first to the second. And then you start adding fresh material to the first cell. So the idea here is that, in the course of 3 months, you will have well-cooked, well-prepared, well-cured compost in that 3rd cell. Like I mentioned already in this episode, I refer to these as like micro composting systems. So these are going to be ideal for someone who has a really small space to work with. Maybe you really do just have a patio, or maybe you have, a space in your garage that you could like rig up a composting system. Like you just don't have a lot of space, but you do want to compost. These are going to be the systems that you should consider, in my opinion. The first one, I'm going to start with the weirdest one, also the coolest one, also the one that may not be best for beginners. And full disclosure, I have not used this composting system yet, just because I'm like working myself into it. But it's called Bokashi. It's a fun word to say. You should try saying it. Bokashi. 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 And this is super weird, super cool. All of the coolest things are also the weirdest things. But this form of decomposition, it's a fermentation process that happens within Bokashi to break down all sorts of things. This is like high power compost breakdown magic. And it uses like this little fermented mother, like a SCOBY for brewing your own kombucha. And this is usually a contained system. So you would need like a large 5-gallon bucket or some kind of bin to contain this fermented mother and all of your food waste. But because you're using this Bokashi mother, you actually can put like meat and bones and cheese and milk products in your Bokashi system at home. So if you're interested, I will put some links in the show notes so you can learn more about Bokashi. I am still learning a ton about this composting system, but that's just like a little tiny glimpse of what I know. So, and because you can put it in like a bucket, it's very small space friendly, but it's not the only option for small spaces. Like I mentioned, I also have a compost tumbler at home in addition to my pile and my worm bin. Oh my God, I just love my worms. So let's start with the tumbler because I think this would be a great solution for many of you who are tuning in. If you have a small space, you want to start composting, you can get a compost tumbler. I love these for multiple reasons. One, they are contained systems. So it's literally usually like a black plastic bin that moves. Sometimes it comes on a stand. Sometimes you can just roll around in your backyard, but it tumbles, right? So it's a compost tumbler and it's usually black plastic. And typically it has a divider or 2 or 3 in it. And like I was mentioning with the bin system, you can have one side that you're actively adding ingredients to, and you can have another side that's resting. Because ideally, you're letting your compost cure or rest for 60 to 90 days before you actually use it. So it's important to understand like what side is working and what side is resting. I also put a little fencing around my compost tumbler because they can like leak a little bit from the bottom. And I just don't want my dogs to get in that. Some people will also like put like an old plastic Tupperware or something underneath their compost tumbler to collect like the water that drips out of it. Compost tea, so good. Like the lid on the tumbler will have a plus sign or a minus sign depending, on the style and brand that you get. I'll put a link in the show notes for the tumbler that I use in case you want to pick that up. The plus and minus signs are helpful because that can designate like which side is working, which side you should be adding to. The great thing about the tumbler is that it makes turning or aerating your compost a breeze because literally all you have to do is turn the tumbler. Mine comes on a stand and there's like little ridges in the tumbler itself. So you can kind of like grab onto the ridge and like pull it down. And it's really fun because it just spins around really quickly. And then it like, kind of like swings back to a stop. And then you can just do that a couple times, like once a week or every other week or whenever you add stuff to your compost pile. And that's how you turn it. Super fun. Compost tumblers are great for small spaces. I do just want to mention, like, I'm not sure if you guys have seen this advertised on social media, or maybe it's just my social media feed, but there's something out there that's really intriguing to me. And I'm like kind of on the fence about getting one, mainly just because of the price point. But it's called Lomi, and it's a countertop composting system. And my impression is that it's like a pressure cooker composter thing. And it can literally turn your food waste into compost in like a couple hours on your kitchen counter. It's pretty fascinating. I don't know if any of you guys have one of those or if you've looked into it more, but if you do have one, just let me know because I am super curious. Well, moving right along to vermicomposting or composting with the help of earthworms. Yo. So I've already mentioned this, and you could probably guess just by the tone of my voice that I love composting worms. 2 years ago, I bought this book called Worms Eat My Garbage. It was recommended to me by a friend. I talked about it a couple episodes ago, but it walks you through how to compost at home using earthworms, specifically composting worms, and even more specifically, red wigglers. So yeah, I bought this book and I was really into it, and I got a recommendation also from my friend, and I'll put this link in the show notes for you as well, for something called the Urban Worm Bag. Yeah. So it's this 2 foot by 2 foot bag, and it comes with a little stand, and the stand is about, I don't know, like waist high. So maybe like 30 inches high. And you put the bag like on the stand, and then the top is zippered. You've got like a little 2 foot cube, perfect 2 foot cube that you can add your compost and your worms to. This is going to sound really weird, but it's so true. You can order red wigglers online from Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. No joke, y'all. Uncle Jim and his worms. And the book, Worms Eat My Garbage, gives you guidance on how many worms you should get for the space that you're starting to vermicompost in. So for me, I think it was something like 2,000 worms, like little baby worms that weighed, I think it was like a pound or two of worms. I ordered my worms online and I got my worm bag and I set it up, and you put bedding. So you fill like half the bin or half the bag with bedding, which you can use like, I forget what all they said, but I think I just used like leaf litter that fell. Yeah, just like leaves that fell. So I put some leaves in there, maybe some cardboard, maybe some like shredded paper, and then you put your worms in there, and then you start feeding them. You can literally like feed them so much. I put so much food in there, and they're so hungry, and they just eat it all up and turn it into beautiful vermicompost, earthworm castings, what have you. But I probably feed them like once a week, and a lot. I produce a lot of compost just from the kitchen, and I feed them all of that. I also, whenever I go to the grocery store, I'm all about a reusable shopping bag, but I'm also all about using paper bags that I can feed to my worms because they love them. When you're composting with worms, they don't like to be super cold and they don't like to be super hot. So we have like a walk-in unfinished basement. It still gets heated in the winter and cool in the summer because, it's just right under the house. And so, our HVAC system helps to regulate the temperature down there. And that's where I keep my worms. You'll be most successful in a space that kind of stays of a comparable temperature year round. You should get some composting worms. Again, I'll put all of that information in the show notes for you. Before we get to questions, just one final section of information to share with you, and that is talking about best practices and the things that you should be putting into your compost and kind of the certain cadence or rate at which you should be adding things. There are two main types of things that you should put in your compost. Maybe you've heard of these terms before, but it's browns and it's greens. So your greens, we'll start with those. Your greens are going to be things that come fresh out of the kitchen or fresh plant material. So, it could be your onion peels, it could be apple peels, it could be, the ends of your celery and the centers of your peppers. And eggshells are also considered a green. You can use coffee grounds, coffee filters, tea bags. There's also any plants that you're pulling from your growing space and putting in your compost. Those are considered greens as well. And then your browns are going to be materials that you should add to your compost that are high in carbon, like cardboard or brown paper, regular paper, shredded mail, even paper towel rolls, toilet paper rolls. All of those are browns, and those can be added to your compost as well to break down. Now, the browns, like I mentioned, they have higher amounts of carbon to help break down things faster. They're also going to add more structure to your compost, which helps with aeration. All of these things work together to help accelerate the decomposition process. So making sure that you have about half and half, which when I share that with people, they're always like, oh, wow, I need that many browns. Yeah, you need half browns, half greens in your compost pile. Oh, and how could I possibly forget this? Another great brown to add to your compost, leaves. The leaves that fall right now, this time of year. Yep. Just hold on to them, add them to your compost. Those are fantastic free browns. Things that you do not want to put in your compost at home are going to be plastic. No plastic ever, no glass, no metal, things that don't break down. And then for the home composter, for the most part, just don't put any meat, don't put any dairy, don't put any bones, no grease. It will definitely break down if you put meat and other things in there, but it will be smellier and you will attract different kinds of organisms to your compost pile, some of which are not as pleasant as others. Yeah, you can use your imagination. This wraps up most of the information that I wanted to share with you about composting. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to get to all of those lovely questions that you all submitted. This podcast is sponsored by Plant Club by the Patio Farmer. Plant Club by the Patio Farmer is a monthly subscription service I started in 2020. It's a membership-based opportunity to take your growing journey to the next level. With 4 different membership options, you get to decide the amount and kind of support that's right for you. All Plant Club members receive access to my online community through a platform called Circle. Having access to this platform allows members to share pictures, ask questions, celebrate harvests, and get to know each other. All Plant Club members also have access to free seeds each month, along with information on how to plant and tend to their crops, with seeding instructions and downloadable resources from the Patio Farmers Resource Library. Membership starts at just $14 a month. Join Plant Club today by visiting my website, thepatiofarmer.com/membership. Now, back to composting. So now we are going to get to all of your questions. Okay, so the first question actually came up during a consultation I had recently. And the question that they had for me was, how do you know when your compost is ready to use? Fantastic question. You want to look for something that looks like soil. There should not be like chunks of carrot or chunks of whatever you added to your compost pile. You want it to all look like dark brown, like really rich soil. And typically, this process takes between 60 and 90 days, depending on your system, your setup. Compost actually, as it's breaking down, it borrows nitrogen from its surroundings. So sometimes if you add compost that's not fully broken down, you're actually stalling or delaying the growth and health of your plants by not using something that's fully processed. I know it can be hard, but waiting 90 days, not adding anything new, and looking for like that rich, fine, soft soil is what you're looking for. That's how you know it is ready to use. Okay, so this next question actually came from my mother-in-law, Liz, who will probably listen to this episode at some point. So, hey, Liz, a little shout out to you. But she was visiting this weekend and she's so wonderful and supportive. And she was telling me that she's listened to all of my podcast episodes, which is just so kind. Liz has a beautiful growing space. She lives up in the mountains. And basically her question was, is there a wrong way to compost? No, there's not. Like, as long as you are following these like few guiding principles, there's no right way or wrong way to do something. There's just like best practices and learnings from those who've gone before you. But like, you can find a composting system that you don't have to turn, or like you can use different methods and different techniques to find that perfect balance that's going to work great for you and that's still going to produce healthy compost for you. So there are different styles and different practices, but one is not better than another, and it's really kind of that experimentation and playing around and finding what's going to be best for you. So no, there's no incorrect way to compost. The next question that came to me, this one actually came in through Instagram, and the question is related to something that I had mentioned last week with the USDA ag zones changing and wondering if, the change in our climate is going to have any effect on how we compost at home. And I love the thoughtfulness and the connection that was drawn between, our changing climate. I would say not directly. If anything, it should be more of an encourager to begin composting at home. Maybe we can increase our carbon offset, perhaps. But in terms of like the technical process or, the conversion process of plant material into nitrogen-rich plant food, it's not, I wouldn't say that there's any impact on composting systems based off of the redraw of the ag zone map. So great question. Thank you for being mindful. But no, I don't foresee any like immediate impacts to your composting system. The next question that came in is from a Plant Club member. So shout out to Plant Club members, but asking what the best method is if your bin must be in the shade. So thank you for asking this question. And going back to some of the content that I was sharing earlier, heat is definitely a factor to consider when you're composting. The warmer your compost pile is, the faster you're going to get breakdown. The cooler your compost is, or the more shady for composting is, then the slower that decomposition is going to be. So it will still break down. You'll still be able to compost even if you are composting in the shade, but it may take longer. So maybe your compost will be fully cured in 120 days instead of 90 days. Or, somewhere in between. And then the other question that came along with this one from the same Plant Club member, thanks for sending two, is what browns can you use that aren't leaves and that aren't toxic? And that is a great question. I would be curious to understand why you want to look beyond leaves for composting, because I think they're great and they're a free source of browns. And knowing the person who submitted this question, I would imagine that you have leaves pretty readily available. So just curious, maybe I'll ask you later why you don't want to use leaves. But things that are not toxic, I can't really speak to all of the ins and outs of what goes into cardboard production, but my impression is that cardboard is fairly non-toxic. especially if you can use cardboard that does not have a waxy coat on it. I would steer clear of any like waxy or like plastic tape or anything like that. Having that go in your compost. Most of the glues that go into holding pieces of cardboard together, and it's really usually just that one seam. Most of those these days are plant-based. They're like starch, plant-derived starch glues that break down. And our last question for today also came from another Plant Club member, one of our newest Plant Club members. So shout out to you. Thanks for asking this question. And her question is, do I have to turn the compost pile? The short answer is no, you do not have to turn the compost pile. But if you do turn your compost pile, then the decomposition will be accelerated and you'll get a finished product sooner. Okay, so those are all the questions. Thank you again to everyone who submitted something ahead of today's episode for me to address. I love hearing from you guys and giving you the information that you're looking for. So if you ever have a specific question related to what you're growing at home, or even like tangentially related to growing your own food, honestly, whatever's on your mind and you think I could help, I would love to hear from you. And you can always send me questions to thegrowingspacepodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's thegrowingspacepodcast@gmail.com. But I do just want to give you a preview for next week's episode. We are going to be talking all about seeds, and specifically seed companies, and which ones are my favorite, why they're my favorite. It is time to be requesting seed catalogs. So I feel like next week's episode is perfectly timed for getting a head start on all of your planning and seed shopping for next year, for 2024. So I will be sharing my favorite seed companies with you. I also have a very exciting announcement to share with you next week regarding, of course, regarding seeds and regarding plans for next year. So be sure to tune in to next week's episode for all of that seedy goodness. And if you've listened to my podcast in the past, then you know that at the end of every episode, I share a fun fact or like a helpful tip or a fun story, or I don't know, just something fun to end the episode on. And today I have two fun things to share with you. I could not talk about composting here in Charlotte without mentioning a fantastic local resource called Crowntown Compost. And I will put their information in the show notes. But the guys at Crowntown Compost are wonderful. And for the last 6 going on 7 years, I've worked with them in various ways, various capacities. But Crowntown Compost is a compost subscription service. Yeah, I said it. Compost subscription service. So you can hire them to come to your house, like, I think it's like every other week or weekly, and pick up your food waste. You put it in a cute little bucket, or you can get a bin. They'll come and pick up your food waste and haul it away to a composting facility, compost it for you. Yes, very cool. And then twice a year, you get compost in return. So it's super cool. And if you listen to this episode and you're like, oh gosh, like I still just don't know about composting. I don't know if it's right for me, but like I'm really into like the whole reducing my waste. And I would like to have, some nutritious plant food for my plants, but I just don't know if I have the space or the time or the commitment to do it myself. Never fear. Crowntown Compost is here. If you live in Charlotte, of course. If you don't live in Charlotte and you're interested in a composting subscription service, check out, some options in your community. Maybe you also have a compost subscription service. And then one other little fun tidbit and morsel for you is I am running an abundance sale right now for the holidays. Yep. As you do as a small business owner, getting in on all of those holiday sales. So if you are looking for any fun gift ideas for the aspiring green thumb in your life, or maybe you just want some things, I will put a link in the show notes to my order form, and you can shop all of the things that I have available. And I do offer shipping. So if you don't live in the Charlotte area, I can ship things to you, everything except for plants. And if you do live in the Charlotte area, I will hand deliver your order to you. So I will put that in the show notes, and I will see you next week. As we walk into the month of December, the 12th month of the year, have a great rest of your week.